But before we go on, I want to introduce to you the woman who will introduce Lynn, Mrs. Amelia Boynton Robinson, Vice Chairperson of the Schiller Institute, Civil Rights Heroine, and a dear friend and leader of our movement. Amelia.
Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Valentine's Day. I think that's the reason why I have the red on. And since this is Negro History Week, I would like to speak of one person, and that is Benjamin Banneker. And I notice when I turn the radio on or the TV on, it's always something about some one character. And Benjamin Banneker is a man who laid out and is responsible for Washington, D.C. being as it is today. The Frenchman took the blueprints and got angry and went back to France. And he had in his head everything that this Frenchman had laid out. And today you have Washington, D.C. Not only that, he made the first clock, the first wooden clock that ran for 50 years. And I think most of us know about the almanac that we used to have. That was given to America. So that's a contribution that was made. And this is Negro History Week month. And I'm glad to inform you of that. I am very much disturbed because of the news media making so much fuss over the Jacksons. If half of that time were used to tell the truth of what is happening in America, then Americans will be much more informed. They have said very little or perhaps nothing about our servicemen who have come back from the Iraq War and many of them from the Vietnam War, who are now down in Gordon and in Georgia. And it is there that they are in barracks where they're supposed to be 40 men. They have 80 of these servicemen who have returned. Many of them are mentally disturbed, emotionally disturbed, having broken bones, walking on crutches, and they are all herded up in these barracks. When they get ready to go to a restroom or a toilet or take a shower, they have nowhere in the barracks. And they have to walk to the toilets outside. And having lived in the section where there is sand, they have to go through the sand. And there's nothing that can grow in the sand but these stickers. And that's the way they are treating our young men. And these are kids. They may be some of your friends, your children. That's where they have them. And when the news was broken, and we, Schiller Institute, broke the news, we got it from the UPI, United Press International, in Europe, And I got the opportunity to call the person who gave us the information. And they said the half has never been told. So we need to realize that we have to know what is going on in our own country. We have to know how to fight back. And we can't do it unless we know the truth. And the truth is not being given to us. In these cases where we have these servicemen in barracks, some of them waiting from 1 month to several months trying to see a doctor. They can't even see a doctor. The objective is not to give them pensions. And it's been said that they had these illnesses before they went to the service. Why would they take them if they had emotional or upset trouble? It is because of the fact that it is not the truth. Not only that, the objective is not to pay them pensions. Just go home and die. That's the objective. And yet, they went as brave soldiers, feeling as though they are fighting for a country of liberty, a country of freedom. And they come back, and they're not free to get even medicine to cure their illnesses. That is sad. And I think we all need to write to our congressmen, our senators, and to others, and let them know what is happening. It happened when I heard the news. I was in Germany. First I was here. And immediately I made an attempt to contact my governor because of the fact that we have a hospital there, a veterans hospital, and the hospital is almost empty. And they have these people in barracks. I contacted the office of the senator, of my congressman, and then I decided, well, I'll call John Lewis. And I was in Nina's office. And when we called John Lewis, his associate said, well, he's on the floor. And Nina said, get him off of the floor. Get him off of the floor. Ms. Robinson wanted to talk to him. And he came, and I told him, and he didn't know anything about it. But he said, I'll see what we can do. But you know, when people are bought, they won't say anything. They'll tell you a lie, just in order that they can pacify you. So what we need to do, we need to find out more about it, because the news media will, and we know that it is bought also. We need to know more about what is happening here with the servicemen and with many other things. And the only way that we are going to hear the truth of what's going on is through this organization and through those who head and who lead this organization. I congratulate your speaker. Not only congratulate him, but I am happy to have known him. And I'm happy to be able to converse with him. Somehow, he never ceases to amaze me with his wisdom, with the strength to endure the pressure of the evils, and yet he loves mankind. I have searched the Bible for characters that I could compare him with. And I can compare him with a combination of many. I think of Noah, who abstained from the participation of a wicked world I can compare him with Job, who had the patience and he was given the strength to endure the injustices, and even the pains. I compare him with Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice his loving son to please God. And there was Moses, who brought the children of Israel out of captivity, and of Solomon, who stunned the world with his wisdom. I also compare him with Paul, who, though imprisoned, continued to communicate with the outside world, establishing churches and writing letters to the Jews and the Gentiles. And last but not least, I compare him with having been endowed with the unusual portion of the Spirit of God that is in all of us. The spark of love, honesty, justice, and freedom for all people throughout the entire world is now a kindled flame. And the free spirit that he has endows all of us. He is a real man of the government of the people, by the people, for the people, and he rapidly spreads his love, his understanding, his care for everybody. The physical walls are crumbling, and we know it, and the flame of the epistle of love can be found in him, that he has made us aware that untruth and lies will not continue to be heard and be taken by the system. He is exposing that we know is wrong, but somehow we accept it, and many people within the world, it becomes a part of, until they wake up and they realize that I have been unjustly treated because I have been told lies. But the truth comes out, and it comes out in this, our speaker, and this organization that is carrying on the goodwill and the justices that he knows and that he is implanting in each and every one of you. I present to some of you and introduce to others our speaker for the day, who has so much to tell us and so much we need to know, Lyndon H. LaRouche. Take over.
She's always the same. This is as I have promised, a truly momentous occasion. It's a historic occasion, more than historic, because we're looking at not only the collapse of an empire which came into being about 250 years ago, between 1755 and 1763, when the French victory over the British victory over the French in particular, established the British East India Company as an empire casting itself in the image of the Roman Empire, an empire which was constituted by a group of banking interests, essentially of Venetian origin, which ran the British East India Company and ran the company as itself an empire. At that point in 1763, the British Empire as it then existed, was led by a man who has not quite reached his 30th birthday, known as the Marquess of Lansdowne later, and also more notorious as Lord Shelburne. This man set forth two operations, part of the same thing, in place, which have governed the direction of world history as world history from that time to the present day. The first intent of Shelburne was to destroy the English-speaking colonies of North America. And he assigned a number of people, including Adam Smith, as agents to conduct that policy. This was the policy which led to the American Revolution and led to the establishment of the greatest threat which the British Empire has faced to the present day, the American Revolution and the establishment in 1789 of the Federal Constitution of the United States. The greatest single threat to that empire on this planet over the entire past quarter century has been that process which created the United States. At the same time, Shelburne and company, through agents including Adam Smith, most notably Jeremy Bentham and others, organized in France around some of the followers of Voltaire, organized a cult, a Freemasonic cult called the Martinists. This Martinist cult, which included assets of Shelburne, such as Jacques Necker of Lausanne, Switzerland, Philippe Égalité, and others, set into motion on July 14, 1789, the Bastille event, which was intended to bring the danger of a spread of the influence of the United States to an end worldwide. Because at that moment, you'd had the attempt by Bailly and by Lafayette to introduce a reform in France which would have established a constitutional monarchy, which would have steered that monarchy along economic development lines akin to those policies adopted by the United States with its Constitution. So again, this is the way history has gone. The two English-speaking foci of the current of world history, the United States, which represented the best currents in Europe, typified by the classical humanists and the influence of Leibniz, typified by the tradition of the Treaty of Westphalia, typified by the legacy of the 15th century Renaissance. These were the great English-speaking forces in the world, which were assembled for a collision which is now coming to a point of historic decision in the weeks and months immediately ahead of us. This is the one way or the other. This is the end of the Anglo-Dutch liberal model of parliamentary government and its influence in the United States, either for better or for very much worse. Now, it should be recalled that the Martinists, who were used by Shelburne and run largely directly out of London by Bentham as the head of the secret committee of the British Foreign Office, which had been created by Shelburne, they ran the French Revolution. They ran the affair of the Bastille. They ran the Jacobin Terror. Danton and Marat were British agents, trained in London, deployed from London, and delivering speeches in France written in London under the direction of Bentham. The Jacobin Terror was run from London. Napoleon was a creation of the Martinist Freemasonic Lodge, the Napoleonic Empire. And then when the time came and Napoleon and his empire had essentially destroyed much of Europe, then the British said, okay, get rid of Napoleon. It was done by Germans, actually. And they set up the Vienna Congress, which was a sexual Congress of Vienna, where countesses and others diverted the count-head estates and Castlereagh and for the British, and Castlereagh's stooge, in Austria, ran what became the Vienna Congress. And in good time, and the British had planned well, that Metternich disappeared over the period from 1830 to 1832 to 1848. It was an operation run by Bentham's successor, Lord Palmerston, who ran Giuseppe Mazzini, the head of Young Europe, an organization which recruited Karl Marx. So the entire operation of the Revolution of 1848 was run by British intelligence for the purposes of finishing off the power of the Habsburgs and making them a subordinate agent within a British-controlled empire. We were almost crushed repeatedly. The intention of Britain was to destroy us. This was the perpetual policy of the British toward the United States and the policy of the key traders within the United States, such as Gallatin, such as Aaron Burr, such as the leadership of many of the political parties, the controllers of agents such as Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, Polk, Pierce, Buchanan, who were agents of the enemy determined to destroy us. In the process, the American patriotic tradition had a resurgence around the tradition of Lafayette, around the personality of John Quincy Adams, and with a very significant recruit by John Quincy Adams to his cause, the Whig, Abraham Lincoln, who was Quincy Adams' voice in the Congress in denouncing the Polk presidency for the war against Mexico of that period. And that president, later, Lincoln president, led the United States to return to itself as a nation. And we emerged from that civil war as the greatest single nation-state power on this planet in terms of economics. The British had more power as an empire, but we were the most powerful state, the greatest economy, the most progressive economy in the world by 1876. This was the work of Lincoln's Revolution. We had become ourselves. But meanwhile, the Anglo-Dutch liberals were already at work, subverting us with Andrew Johnson, who was a disaster, and others. And so we went through these processes. At the beginning of the century, we were destroyed by the assassination of a president, McKinley. It's an assassination run by the same interests for the purpose of putting Teddy Roosevelt in the presidency. Teddy Roosevelt was a member of the Confederacy tradition. His uncle, who trained him, who steered him, who crafted his career, Bullock, was the chief of intelligence of the Confederacy who operated from London during the period of the Civil War. The real successor of Teddy Roosevelt, who destroyed the American system in the name of trust busting. He destroyed the American system in order to create hegemony for New York-based British and other bankers for their system. In other words, he transferred the power from industry and agriculture to the financiers. He was succeeded by a passionate advocate for the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson launched the mass mobilization and revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States during his presidency from the White House publicly and personally. So this was the corruption which grabbed us from the time of the McKinley assassination until Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt, despite his own party, became president. His party did everything possible, the Democratic Party, to prevent him from becoming the Democratic nominee. And was also the same filthy bankers of the Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson tradition who did it. But Franklin Roosevelt saved the United States in a unique way by his leadership. But then he died. And even before he died, we were in trouble. The history of this process in the 20th century is quite interesting. The British policy, that is the policy of the British East India Company, its followers, had always been to use war on the continent of Europe as a way of putting the nations of continental Europe against each other's throat in such a fashion that there would never be a threat of a challenge to British supremacy from the continent. This was a characteristic of the 19th century and was also the continuing characteristic deep into the 20th century. So the time came at the end of the so-called First World War, which had been concocted by the British, especially by a man who has been dead, Edward VII, the man who created the Federal Reserve System in the United States through his agents here, including Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. The British had decided at the end of the World War I to close in and create a new kind of world empire. The empire was the empire of fascism. It was the empire of the Syndicus International, which we knew was fascism from 1922 through 1945. The forces behind this fascism were bankers, including Lazare Frère in France and others. These bankers conspired to install fascism on the continent of Europe. Some of these fascists went further around Hitler. They conceived of creating a world empire along the following lines, which came to a crisis point in 1940, when the remains of the British Expeditionary Force was sitting on the sands of Dunkirk, waiting for Hitler's tanks to pounce off and finish them off. Hitler held back his tanks at that time, very momentous, which gave, because Hitler thought that the British establishment was going to join the Nazis in a program of world conquest whose target included the destruction of the United States. Here was the plan. This is Churchill as Defense Minister of England, of Britain, sitting in opposition to these fascists, not because he wasn't a fascist, but because he didn't think it was in British interests to play this game, or British imperial interests. The fascist plan, including people in London, a very high rank, some of whom were never prosecuted for what they did, conceived of taking the British Navy, the German Navy, the French Navy, the Italian Navy, and the Japanese Navy as one force, which once the Soviet Union had been quickly destroyed by this alliance, would then turn on the United States and destroy the power of the United States. The reason that didn't happen is that the British Navy did not join the Nazis at that point, that Hitler was sitting there poised, ready to receive them with open arms as part of his alliance, which is why he didn't crush the British Expeditionary Force when he could in Dunkirk. Churchill said, no, we will not let someone from the continent of Europe, even if we like his nastiness, such as Hitler, to take over control of the British Empire. And therefore we will even degrade ourselves to go to our so-called American cousins, even to one we hate the most, Franklin Roosevelt, and seek his cooperation in defeating the Nazis. So a German official, Canaris, who was not exactly a Hitler man, prevailed upon Francisco Franco, another nasty fascist in the tradition of the Inquisition, not to occupy Gibraltar. Because had the alliance gone through, and had Gibraltar been occupied by the Nazis, i.e. Franco, then you would have had the Mediterranean would have been a closed lake controlled by this alliance. Under those conditions, the existence of civilization would have been in jeopardy. Canaris prevailed upon and frightened Franco into refusing Hitler's demand that he seized Gibraltar. So this combination of decisions, Churchill says the British fleet will go to Canada if England is invaded and will ally with the United States. This decision did not prevent the war, but it ended the possibility of Hitler's world conquest. Therefore, in 1944, once the Allied forces led by the United States had made the breakthrough in Normandy, and the case of the Wehrmacht position on the continent of Europe was in permanent terminal jeopardy, and was saved only because the British intelligence services informed the Nazis of the plot for peace. And they hanged the generals in July 1944. At that point, there was a turn in U.S. policy. At those bankers who had been for Hitler, like Harriman, Morgan, Mellon, DuPont, the same types of bankers who had conspired to assassinate the President of the United States in 1933-34 in the thing that was testified before the Congress on the general's plot. These guys went back to their old ways. Their policies were, at that point, take a right turn, go to utopian policy, use weapons of mass destruction, including the nuclear weapon which the United States was developing in experimental mode at the time, and air power to conduct a new kind of warfare, and to use a war against the Soviet Union, or with the Soviet Union, as the pretext for this policy. In other words, going back to the same Nazi policy that Hitler and company and his allies in Europe, in France, in Italy, and so forth, had up to 1940, up to June 1940. Go for a war against the Soviet Union as the way of putting this policy into place. And we had in the United States, we had a reign of terror in the United States, which reached a peak in about 1947. Later it became known as McCarthyism. McCarthy was a joke. Joe McCarthy. Truman was the problem. But not all of our people in this country were fools. There was a plan already, which I sort of was party to, in a sense, in 1947, to have Eisenhower run for the Democratic nomination and get Truman out of there. The only way to save the United States. Eisenhower turned it down, but did run for president later. And Truman got us into a Korea War through his own stupidity, his own recklessness, his own fascist qualities. Some people in Missouri may not like that, but that's what he was. Don't kid yourself. He's a banker's man. And the Korean War became a mess. And about the same time, it was discovered that the Soviet Union had developed priority in a thermonuclear deployable weapon. Preventive nuclear warfare using air power went off the agenda. Truman was told not to run again. Eisenhower was put in place. The Korea mess was put into not deep freeze, but into some kind of management. And we stumbled through two presidencies fairly well. But then, when Eisenhower left office, warning against the danger, not in a clear way, but in a frank way, some honest details, warning against what he called the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex was nothing other than the Bertrand Russell policy, the Winston Churchill policy, the policy of what we call the utopians in the United States, of using nuclear weapons and air power as a way of terrorizing the world into submitting to world government. A new form of empire, an echo of the Roman Empire, a continuation in a new form of the British Empire. That's what he was warning against when he said military-industrial complex. It was not a military-industrial complex. It was actually a commitment by the same crowd whose policies are expressed by Cheney today for world government through nuclear terror. We have lived under different various phases of nuclear terror since the close of the war. It was for this reason that Truman dropped 2 totally unnecessary nuclear weapons on Japan, on the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The last 2 weapons of the type we had, they were experimental prototypes. It took some time before we got online producing nuclear weapons in a line sense. So we went first. Truman's policy was the policy of preventive nuclear warfare, the policy designed by Bertrand Russell, the man who's considered a pacifist. I guess killing everybody makes you a pacifist. Nobody shoots back. That was the policy until the Soviet development of a deployable thermonuclear instrument was known. With that, at that point, Bertrand Russell opened negotiations with Stalin's successor, Khrushchev. This was done in London. And what happened was that Khrushchev and Russell agreed on negotiating a system, a so-called permanent system of world rule based on mutual, what we later called mutual and assured destruction. Now, once Eisenhower was out of office, having made his warning speech, the right wing surged forward in the form of Allen Dulles' caper, The Bay of Pigs. It surged forward in the realization of the plan which Khrushchev and Russell, among others, had concocted in the form of the 1962 missile crisis. And after the Kennedy assassination, which cleared the way for launching the Indochina War, we underwent a great change, which leads to the subject, the immediate subject we have to consider now, in these weeks. We have to decide as a nation, as nations, whether civilization will survive on this planet. That decision will be made in the course of the coming weeks. And I shall indicate what the problem is. But first, get the situation. What happened was that we in the United States underwent a transformation in our national character, which has threatened us with doom today. The danger comes not from someone outside our skins. It comes from our own people. It comes from those who are largely 60 years of age or slightly younger, the so-called baby boomer generation, which occupies the key positions in government, business, and other institutions of the United States today. This is where the source of the danger, not someone from the outside, but a generation from the inside, which did what? They underwent a cultural paradigm shift, as it's called, typified by the rock, drug, sex counterculture during the middle of the 1960s. This was a result of the cumulative effect on their parents' generation, that is my generation, on themselves. Remember, the parents' generation had gone through what? We had gone through a nightmare. The Coolidge, Hoover, Mellon nightmare. We were being destroyed as a nation. I can tell you from my memory of the 1920s, we were disgusting. And then we were hit by the Depression. And we became sheepish, frightened, worried. Roosevelt appealed to the forgotten man in a campaign speech delivered in West Virginia. This aroused the nation. He was able to defeat the Democratic Party and become the presidential nominee. The nation was inspired with the idea that recovery, that hope was possible. So people had been ground down already. Their character, our character changed in the beginning of the 20th century. Look at the literature. Look at what was considered popular entertainment. Look at the popular culture at the beginning of the 20th century. It was disgusting. This is the period of Jim Crow. It was disgusting. We were a disgusting people in our behavior. We were humiliated, like the hand of God had humiliated us. We'd been thrown into a depression. I guess we weren't so good, huh? We must have made some mistakes, huh? But not only were we humiliated in our illusions, our delusions, we were also given hope. We were given a chance, the reality of recovery, that this too shall pass. We were inspired. This degree of inspiration continued in the American forces in the United States and overseas, for example, military forces, up until about the time the 2 bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Things were going bad already. But this little man, this Truman, there was an incident I had, was in service in India before, on my way into northern Burma. And some GIs came to me. Truman, Roosevelt had just died. The announcement had just come through. And so, we want to talk to you. This was during the daytime. Can we meet tonight? So we had one of these improvised meetings at night with a bunch of GIs and me. And the question was, what does the death of Roosevelt mean for us? My answer was simple. I said, I don't know. But I'm terribly worried that a great president should be replaced in such a time as this by this terribly little man. And I was right. The right wing took over. I saw people who had been battle-hardened, who I thought I had understood. And within a year or so, after return from military service into civilian life, I saw people who had been turned into stinking cowards. This was my generation. This was 95% of my generation. It was later called McCarthyism. It was actually better called Trumanism, because it was done under Truman. And it was done under the Harriman crowd, the same Harriman crowd who'd been part of the forces that had put Hitler into power in Germany in the first place. The right wing had taken over America. There was a reaction caused by the reaction against the Korean War, the reaction of the Eisenhower reaction. There was a feeble attempt around President Kennedy to go back in the direction that we had been under Roosevelt. That was crushed. Young people whose parents had become prostitutes, i.e., my generation, don't say anything, don't do anything, don't think anything that might get our family into trouble. Think of your father's job. Don't say anything, don't associate with anybody who might get you in trouble and jeopardize your father's job, or cause you to be ostracized in your school by a whispering campaign. Everybody was afraid of the FBI, the great scarecrow of America. The children were raised, be careful, be bold, be optimistic, be bright, be shining, be acceptable. Learn to go along, to get along. Go with the crowd, go with the flow. And the flow was civil rights. The flow was similar things. And these young people went along with it. They played a significant role in this. But then they were hit by the hammer of the missile crisis, where people were going into bars looking for God. Atheists were suddenly jumping into a beer keg. I found God. And for several days, that was a characteristic of this country. I was there. I remember, I saw it. Don't tell me it didn't happen. I was there. I was a witness to it. I saw most of entire generations go insane. My generation, again, insane. Fear. Crumbled before the idea of an Indochina war. Crumbled. Everything they said they fought for, no longer. And that children had gone worse than crazy. The rock, drug, sex counterculture. Remember where it occurred? The rock, drug, sex counterculture, which had existed as the beatnik culture of the early 1950s, emerged where? It emerged among young people in universities, either on state subsidies or families which could afford the tuition, at the leading Ivy League and other universities in the United States, presumably studying to master history, to master science, professions, and so forth. What are they doing? They're fleeing from their textbooks into a night with marijuana and red wine mixed, a night with LSD, a night with sex and anything that crawled, then figure out what the sex was in the morning. This was what happened. The throbbing beat of the drum to silence thought, to silence all thought. Wild entertainment. The cult of Dionysus reborn in America. Where did it start from? It started from the so-called cream of the crop, the young generation entering universities, especially leading universities, during the middle of the 1960s. They've turned against technology. Technology is bad. We've got to stop technology. We've got to go back to nature. And they took their clothes off to prove it. We became that. We have undergone what is called a cultural paradigm shift over the past 40 years, in which the generation which entered universities in the middle of the 1960s are the worst offenders. And the more high-ranking they are today, generally the worse they are, because they represent the leading edge of a cultural trend. It's a great transformation, cultural transformation. And this is the great source of danger. See, we've been through depressions, follies before. But this has something different in it. We in the United States, never before, as almost virtually an entire generation, have repudiated the culture of modern Western European civilization. And this, of course, this spread in Europe too, the same way it spread in other parts of the world. We never repudiated it. We sinned against it, we violated it, but we didn't repudiate it. For 40 years, the generation now in leading, controlling positions of power in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, have repudiated civilization. We have in the United States gone from being, in Kennedy's time, the world's leading producer society, the greatest producer of agricultural and industrial goods, the world leader in technology. We went from being that to becoming a relic, a caricature of Rome under the Caesars, especially from 1971-72. In 1971-72, what did we do? We shut down the monetary system, the fixed exchange rate monetary system that Roosevelt had established. The system which had given us the possibility of recovery in the post-war period. We shut it down. We went to what is called a floating exchange rate system. Now, what did we do with this floating exchange rate system? We went to poor countries of the world, more and more. We said, we will determine the value of your currency under a floating rate system. We sent the IMF and the World Bank to enforce it. We pushed down the value of their currencies by speculative runs organized on the London financial market. We then went to the government and said, call in the IMF, call in the World Bank, get some advice. The advice was, drop the value of your currency. And the frightened government said, all right. Okay, so we'll pay in our... No, you don't pay in your money anymore. You pay in dollars. How do we do that? Well, we give you a debt, an additional debt you didn't incur. We dictate it to you. We create it, and we tell you to take it. This debt is based on the estimated difference in value between your currency before we devalued it and afterward. That is what the debt of South and Central American countries today is. There's no country in South and Central America in general which owes a nickel to anybody, including Argentina. It's all, the debt is entirely artificial. Then what do we do? And look at Mexico after 1982, after what they did to Mexico in 1982, between August and October of 1982. What did they do? They destroyed the Mexican economy. What did they do then? They said, we will use your cheap labor. So what we have done as a nation, we have gone to the poorest countries of the world, or those we made poor by decree. We've told them, you will now produce cheap goods for us. And they're going to be cheap, buddy, even if you die doing it. Then we said, okay, we're getting our goods not from our production, we're getting it from cheap labor in foreign countries. Therefore, we can shut down our factories. We can go into globalization. We can let NAFTA go into effect. We now suck the blood of the world. We bring slave labor into the United States and we call it illegal immigrants. But we bring it in because we want the cheap labor. We force Mexico to supply cheap labor even at the cost of the lives of people who are paid so little that they cannot survive or raise a family on that income, not physically. We do the same thing throughout South America. We conduct genocide in Africa because in 1974, Kissinger and others devised a policy of genocide against Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. The policy was, those raw materials in the African shield, they belong to us. We can't let the Africans use them up. If they let their population grow, they will use them up. If we let Africans have technology, they will use it up more rapidly. Therefore, we have to do something about these Africans and their voracious tendencies to survive. How do we do it? Genocide. And genocide is an Anglo-American Israeli trick in Africa. That's simple. It's done through corporate vehicles, it's done in other ways, it's done through private armies organized in the usual customary way, the same way Iran-Contra was organized. That's how it's done. So what we've done is we've now created a world which is no longer self-sustaining. Europe is bankrupt. It just happens that the United States is more bankrupt. And Japan, financially, is the most bankrupt nation in the world. How did they become bankrupt? By subsidizing the United States dollar. So we now come to a world which, in terms of Europe and the Americas, cannot survive on its present levels of productivity. Our level of infrastructure collapse in the United States today, in power generation and distribution, and mass transit, and so forth, is poorer by a large margin than the time that Franklin Roosevelt was elected president. We are on the verge of destruction. And what's the enemy? Well, what are the alternatives? As President of the United States, or if it were decided that I was going to be nominated as President of the United States today, the problem would be under control as far as the international monetary financial system would exist. Because I know from our discussions with people in Europe and elsewhere that the potential, just like what happened yesterday in Italy, in this discussion there, in the Italian parliament, that the people in Europe, if the United States would make certain proffers of policy, that the nations, most of the nations of continental Europe, including some of the Brits, many of the Brits, would agree to go along with that policy, which would be essentially a return to the philosophical standpoint of the original Bretton Woods Agreement, to put the entire present system into financial reorganization, monetary financial reorganization, to ensure stability, and to launch a pattern of growth on this planet. That, in a sense, echoing what Roosevelt did philosophically in 1933-34, that can be done today. It requires the political will. It requires an initiative from a president of the United States or someone who was understood as going to be a president of the United States. Under those conditions, leading nations of Europe and other parts of the world will immediately begin to adapt to such a proposal from the United States. That I can guarantee. My job is to deliver that, because I'm the only American who knows how to do it and has the credibility around the world to be believed in doing that. That's one side of the problem. But why isn't that decision made? Why are Americans insane? Why don't Americans pick a president whose role would ensure a solution for a problem which is crushing the people of the United States, among others? Why are they so insane? Because we have gone, in the generation which dominates politics, which dominates life in the United States today, we have gone from being a producer society whose standard of values is to measure things in terms of productive output and producing for the needs of humanity, to a Roman-style pleasure society. Look at the minds. Look at the minds of the generation now in their 50s and early 60s. Look at them. What are their attitudes? And what is the conflict which has emerged in the United States in particular between young people who were over 18 years of age into the 20s and their parents' generation? Studies have been made by political institutions of the United States over the recent period. Several years ago, there was a change, a fundamental change in relationships between the youth generation and their parents' generation, from a sense of tolerant friction to one of hostility. Young people today, in Europe as in the United States, are saying to their parents' generation, you have given us a no future society in which to live. You are the enemy. Not because you're the enemy, but because as long as you insist successfully on imposing this no future society on us, we don't have a chance to live. And you won't have any children and grandchildren to work for. What has happened is today you have people who, as a result of the cultural paradigm shift, who no longer have productive values, who no longer think of what they give to humanity. They think of the pleasure, the entertainment they get to get them through the next terrible hours of unreality. We are a pleasure society. Look at us, entertainment. Look at us. We are a nation of gamblers, not producers. Everybody's looking for money for nothing by gambling. What do people do in states? The state's got a problem. Bring in the gamblers. The states have a problem. Legalize dope. We are an entertainment society, an entertainment culture, in the same way that Rome, with its Colosseum, its Circus Maximus, with the slaughter of Romans by Romans under emperors like Claudius, Nero, and so forth. We have become that kind of sick culture. We have become a culture in that generation which has lost the moral fitness to survive. They would rather die than change their way of life. They would rather die than give up their entertainment. They will say, as I've written on a number of occasions, I stole this stateroom fair and square, and I'm not giving it up even if this whole ship sinks. That is the idea. I want my pleasure. I want my way of life. Don't try to make me rational. Don't ask me to behave rationally. I need my entertainment. I've got to get through tonight. And otherwise, if I have to face reality, I know I'm a piece of dung. And therefore, the only thing that keeps me from considering myself a piece of dung is my pleasure, my entertainment, my diversion. You see these crazy models. If you take a dirty garment, you rip it to pieces, you put it on a naked, skinny girl, it's a high fashion goggle. And this is the society we've become. This is our problem. So this is the same problem I addressed at Talladega in pointing to the significance of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King had a sense of immortality, which the people around him, including Jesse Jackson, didn't have. So when Martin was killed by courtesy of J. Edgar Hoover, or the wish of J. Edgar Hoover, what happened? The civil rights movement was fragmented. Why? Because leaders did not have the value that Martin had. Martin, as I said, had a sense of immortality. That life is a passage from life to death, from birth to death. There's nothing in it which you can hold on to, except what you contribute by living. And therefore, it is what you are immortally, which is what you are in life. Now, every great leader in society, in a time of crisis, has been a leader precisely because they faced that reality. Not only because they had the talent to lead, but because they had the moral commitment to say that I cannot be bought. You cannot buy me with my fear of death. But I will lead. The problem is the pleasure society is the worst extreme of people who do not believe in their children's future. The baby boomers do not believe in their children's future. And that's what the children of the baby boomers are saying in their sense of hostility toward the baby boomer generation. You have given us deliberately a society which has no future. You're asking us to live in a cage where the animals aren't fed. And we don't like it. We want you to change. They don't say we want to kill you. They haven't gotten to that point yet. That may come later. They say, we want you to change. And that's the conflict. If we cannot change, if we select our choice of president, we select our policies now, in these weeks and months, the way things are going now in general, this nation will not long survive. And either way, this system that was consolidated first in 1763 at the Treaty of Paris, proclaiming the victory and establishment, in fact, of a worldwide British Empire, intentionally modeled upon that of ancient Rome, an empire of a financier power, not legions. That empire has now come to its end. It will not survive. Either we will put it to a merciful conclusion by a revival of the world economy. I'm bringing together a confederation of perfectly sovereign nation states on this planet around principles and issues of construction of the planet and on promotion of the development of the individual within their culture, their national cultures. Or we shall not survive. We must do that. We must not talk about the precedents of former history as if they were legal precedents we must follow. We must talk about the lessons of former history, as I've indicated some of the lessons here today, in brief. We must make a choice. We must say the time for the way we have put humanity through brutal experiences in the past must now finally come to an end. We have in our aspirations in the founding of our republic, we've established the principle of the sovereign nation state as the most suitable form of government for a people. We have also understood that all people have an interest, whether they recognize it yet or not, in having such a form of state for themselves. We should understand by now that the principles of that northern state are so common to us all that despite the fact that we are separate and sovereign, we have a common interest in a system of relation among sovereign states which recognizes that principle reflected in our Declaration of Independence and the preamble of our federal Constitution. The time has come where we need to have a new vision of leadership of this planet. A sense we must now, for the sake of humanity, we must now create a global alliance of respectively sovereign nation states committed to recovery and committed to the principle of the immortality of the human individual. That the meaning of the individual lies not merely what happens between birth and death, which is a very short period of time on which to base a policy. But morality is based on a sense of what we, with our lives, with our talent, give to future generations, and to realizing the intentions of the generations before us. The kind of intention which enables us, if lived, to die with a smile on our face, that we have performed our mission, and it is good, and we are pleased. Why do you think someone like Jeanne d'Arc would, knowing that she was going to be burned alive if she did not compromise, would stick to her mission? If she had not continued her mission, the first modern nation state, France, would not have come into existence. The papacy would not have been restored as it was. Modern society would not have come into existence, the modern nation state. We'd be still living in some kind of feudal hellhole. She had a sense of mission, as all other great leaders of mankind have. And their sense of their interest in their mission overrode the fears of mortality. We need to select and encourage leadership of that kind. With that kind of leadership, and with insight which should be given to us by studying of the history of mankind from the past, we should understand the time has come for a change in the planet. The change to a system of sovereign nation states united by certain common ecumenical principles. We do not need to look forward to war. We will still need to maintain strategic defense. But the transition through strategic defense will be to a world in which war, as we've known it in the past, is no longer a necessary condition of mankind. If we can do that, we shall survive. If we cannot do that, we shall not survive. And if we cannot do that, then we look forward in the early period to a rate of mass death on this planet from forces already set into motion, where the numbers of over 6 billion persons reported living today will be reduced fairly rapidly to something significantly less than 1 billion. We are looking at the brink of a precipitation into a new dark age beyond anything that recorded history has given us before. We have the option, the alternative, of moving upward again and learning this lesson of the mistakes we've made by taking steps to ensure these mistakes are not made again, that we recover from the present situation. That's the message of today. And we have to make the choice in the immediate days and weeks ahead. If we don't change, we are finished. We better start changing now.